Order in the court. The gavel banged loudly, but the 7-year-old girl didn't flinch an inch. Her small hands held a folder of documents that could change everything. Her father was minutes away from being wrongfully convicted, and she was the only person in the world who could save him. "Your Honor, I'm the defense attorney," she said in a shaky but determined voice, but no one could have imagined what would come next. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The fluorescent lights of Jefferson County Courthouse buzzed overhead as 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez clutched a worn briefcase that was almost as big as she was. Her tiny hands trembled, but her brown eyes held a determination that would have impressed seasoned attorneys. The security guard looked down at her with confusion. "Sweetheart, are you lost? Where's your mommy?" Officer Jenkins asked, his voice gentle but concerned. Emma straightened her small shoulders, wearing a navy blue dress that her late grandmother had sewn for church. "I'm here for the Rodriguez case, sir. I'm representing my daddy." The guard's eyebrows shot up. In his 15 years at this courthouse, he'd never heard anything like it. "Honey, you can't just—" "I know what I'm doing," Emma interrupted, her voice cracking slightly but remaining firm. "My daddy didn't do what they're saying he did. He's innocent, and I'm going to prove it." 3 months earlier, Michael Rodriguez had been arrested for embezzling $50,000 from Henderson Construction Company, where he'd worked as a foreman for 8 years. The evidence seemed overwhelming. The money had been transferred to an account with his name on it. Security footage showed him accessing the company's safe after hours, and his own signature appeared on falsified invoices. But Emma knew something the police didn't. The night before his arrest, her father had come home with worry lines etched deep across his face. He'd knelt down beside her bed and whispered, "Mija, if anything happens to Daddy, you remember that sometimes good people get blamed for bad things, but the truth always finds a way to shine through the darkness." She hadn't understood then. She did now. With her mother Maria working double shifts as a nurse to pay the bills and unable to afford a lawyer, Emma had made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She would defend her father herself. The public library became her second home. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian, watched in amazement as this tiny girl checked out legal textbooks meant for law students. Criminal law for beginners, understanding court procedures, evidence and testimony. Books that weighed more than Emma's backpack. "Are you sure you can handle these, dear?" Mrs. Patterson had asked. "My daddy's counting on me," Emma had replied simply. Night after night, while other children her age watched cartoons, Emma sat at the kitchen table with highlighters and notebooks, learning words like due process, burden of proof, and reasonable doubt. She slept only 3 hours each night, surviving on determination and the peanut butter sandwiches her mother left for her. The hardest part wasn't understanding the law. It was visiting her father in jail. Through the thick glass partition, Michael Rodriguez looked older, his calloused hands pale from lack of sunlight. His eyes filled with tears every time he saw his little daughter preparing for battle. "Emma, mi amor, you don't have to do this," he'd whispered into the phone. "I'll find another way." "No, Daddy," she'd replied, pressing her small palm against the glass. "You taught me that when someone you love is in trouble, you don't give up, you fight." Now, standing in the marble hallway of the courthouse, Emma checked her watch, a gift from her father that hung loose on her thin wrist. Court would begin in 10 minutes. Judge Harrison had reluctantly agreed to let her represent her father after she'd quoted 3 constitutional amendments and 2 Supreme Court cases from memory during their preliminary meeting. The prosecutor, District Attorney James Mitchell, had laughed when he heard about his opponent. "This'll be the easiest case of my career," he'd told his staff. But Assistant Prosecutor Robert Williams hadn't laughed. Something about the little girl's fierce determination had made him nervous. very nervous, and for good reason. Emma opened her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder marked Evidence. Inside were documents that would change everything, documents that someone had tried very hard to keep hidden, documents that proved her father was innocent. What she didn't know yet was that the real criminal was closer than she imagined, closer than anyone imagined. As Emma walked toward courtroom 3B, her small footsteps echoing in the vast hallway, she had no idea that someone was watching her every move. Someone who knew exactly what was in that manila folder. Someone who would do anything to make sure those documents never saw the light of day. The courthouse clock chimed 9 o'clock. It was time for the fight of her young life to begin. Judge Harrison's gavel echoed through courtroom 3B as Emma Rodriguez walked through the heavy oak doors. Every head turned. Whispers rippled through the gallery like wildfire. Is that really a child? This has to be a joke. Where are her parents? Indeed, but Emma had eyes only for her father, Michael, sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his diminished frame. When their eyes met, he mouthed silently, "I love you, mija." District Attorney James Mitchell rose from his chair, his expensive suit and silver hair commanding immediate respect. At 55, he'd never lost a case this straightforward. He glanced at Emma with barely concealed amusement. "Your Honor," Mitchell began, his voice booming, "I object to this circus. A 7-year-old cannot possibly understand the complexities of criminal law." Judge Harrison, a stern woman in her 60s, leaned forward. "Mr. Mitchell, this court has already ruled on Miss Rodriguez's representation. The defendant has waived his right to counsel, and Miss Rodriguez has demonstrated adequate knowledge of legal procedures." Emma stepped forward, her voice clear despite her racing heart. "Your Honor, my father is innocent. The evidence will show that someone else stole that money and framed him for it." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Assistant Prosecutor Robert Williams shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He kept glancing at Emma's briefcase, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Mr. Mitchell, you may present your opening statement," Judge Harrison announced. Mitchell stood, addressing the jury with practiced confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a simple case of theft. Michael Rodriguez had access to the Henderson Construction Company's safe. Security footage shows him there after hours. The stolen money was found in an account bearing his name. His signature appears on falsified invoices. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable." Emma watched the jury's faces carefully, just as she'd read about in her legal textbooks. Mrs. Chen, the retired teacher in seat 4, looked sympathetic. Mr. Thompson, the mechanic in seat 7, seemed skeptical of Mitchell's certainty. When Mitchell finished, Emma stood. Her legs felt like jelly, but she remembered her father's words. "Courage isn't about not being scared, mija. It's about doing what's right, even when you are scared." "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Emma began, her young voice carrying surprisingly well in the large room, "my daddy taught me that the truth is like a diamond buried in mud. It might be hard to see at first, but when you wash away all the dirt, it shines brighter than anything else." Some jury members leaned forward, intrigued by the unexpected eloquence from such a small person. "The prosecutor wants you to believe that my father stole money from people he considered family. But diamonds don't lie, and neither does my daddy. I'm going to show you evidence that the real thief is still walking free." As Emma returned to her seat, she noticed Assistant Prosecutor Williams whispering urgently into his phone. His face had gone pale, and his hands were shaking. Something was very wrong. And Emma was beginning to suspect what it was. The prosecution's first witness was Sarah Henderson, daughter of the construction company owner. At 32, she managed the company's finances with meticulous attention to detail. "Miss Henderson," Mitchell began. "Please tell the court about the missing funds." Sarah's voice was steady but sad. $50,000 disappeared from our operating account over 3 months. The money was transferred to an account registered under Michael Rodriguez's name. Emma watched her father's face crumple with pain. He'd worked for the Henderson family for 8 years, building their trust project by project. "And you discovered this how?" Mitchell continued. "Our bookkeeper, Mrs. Garcia, noticed discrepancies in the monthly reports. When we investigated, we found falsified invoices for materials that were never delivered." Mitchell presented the evidence. Bank statements, transfer records, invoices, everything seemed to point directly at Michael Rodriguez. When Emma's turn came to cross-examine, she stood on a small step stool the bailiff had provided. "Miss Henderson," Emma began, her voice gentle, "you said you trust my father like family, right?" "Yes, I did. That's what makes this so heartbreaking. If someone wanted to steal from your company, they'd need to know a lot about how your business works, wouldn't they?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, they'd need access to our computer systems, knowledge of our suppliers, and understanding of our payment schedules. And they'd need to know exactly when and how to avoid getting caught." "Certainly." Emma pulled a document from her briefcase. "Miss Henderson, this is a list of everyone who had access to your computer systems. Can you read the names for the jury?" Sarah's eyes widened as she read. "Sarah Henderson, Frank Henderson, Mrs. Garcia, Robert Williams." Her voice trailed off. "Robert Williams," Emma repeated, looking directly at the assistant prosecutor, who had gone white as a sheet. "That's Mr. Mitchell's assistant prosecutor, isn't it? The same Robert Williams who used to work for Henderson Construction before becoming a lawyer." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Mitchell jumped to his feet. "Objection! Relevance!" Your Honor," Emma said, her young voice strong and clear. "Mr. Williams had complete access to Henderson Construction's financial systems. He knew their procedures, their schedules, and their security measures. Isn't that relevant to who could have committed this crime?" Judge Harrison looked intrigued. "Overruled. Continue, Miss Rodriguez." Emma turned back to Sarah. "When did Mr. Williams stop working for your company?" "About 6 months ago. He left to join the prosecutor's office." "Just 2 months before the thefts began?" Sarah's face showed dawning realization. "Yes. Exactly 2 months." Williams stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your Honor, I need to step out. I'm feeling unwell." But Emma wasn't finished. "Miss Henderson, did Mr. Williams ever ask you about your new security procedures after he left the company?" Mitchell objected again, but Judge Harrison was now fully engaged. "I'll allow it." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes. He called me several times, saying he was worried about financial security for his former employers. He asked about our new banking procedures and when we updated our password systems." Emma looked at the jury, then at the empty chair where Williams had been sitting. "No further questions, Your Honor." Deeped, as Sarah Henderson stepped down from the witness stand, her face pale with understanding, Emma knew she'd planted the first seeds of doubt, but she also knew she'd made a dangerous enemy. That evening, Emma sat at her kitchen table surrounded by legal documents when her mother, Maria, returned from her nursing shift at Memorial Hospital. Dark circles shadowed Maria's eyes, and her uniform was wrinkled from a 14-hour day. "Mija, how did it go today?" Maria asked, kissing the top of Emma's head. "I think I found who really stole the money, Mama. But now I'm scared they know I found them." Maria's heart clenched. Her 7-year-old daughter shouldn't have to carry this burden, but with no money for a lawyer and Michael's life hanging in the balance, they had no choice. "Tell me everything, Emma." As Emma explained about Robert Williams and his connection to Henderson Construction, Maria's nursing instincts kicked in. She'd seen enough people in crisis to recognize the signs of guilt and desperation. You need to be very careful, Mija. Cornered animals are the most dangerous. Emma nodded, but her attention was focused on the stack of documents before her. Hidden among her father's employment records, she'd found something that didn't belong, a photocopy of a resignation letter from Henderson Construction dated 6 months ago. But it wasn't William's resignation letter. It was signed by someone named David Chen, the same last name as Mrs. Chen, the retired teacher on the jury. Emma's mind raced. Why would this letter be in her father's file? She grabbed her magnifying glass, another tool from her detective kit, and examined the letter more closely. The signature looked wrong. The handwriting was too neat, too practiced, and the date stamp showed it had been photocopied just 2 weeks ago, long after Williams had already left the company. Someone had planted this evidence. Emma's hands trembled as she realized the implications. If Williams was willing to plant false evidence in her father's file, what else had he done? And more importantly, what would he do to stop her from exposing him? A noise outside made Emma freeze. A car had pulled up across the street, its headlights off. In the darkness, she could see a figure sitting in the driver's seat, watching their house. "Mama," Emma whispered, "someone's outside." Maria looked through the curtain and immediately called 911, but by the time the police arrived 20 minutes later, the car was gone. Officer Martinez, who had responded to the call, was skeptical. "Ma'am, there's no evidence anyone was here. Could have been someone visiting a neighbor." But Emma knew better. As the officer drove away, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Lying on their front walkway was a child's toy, a small plastic gavel, like the one she'd seen on William's desk during the trial. The message was clear: stop digging or face the consequences. Emma picked up the toy gavel and held it tight. If Williams thought he could intimidate a 7-year-old girl, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The next morning would bring the prosecution's star witness, security guard Tom Bradley, who claimed to have seen Michael Rodriguez at the company's safe after hours. But Emma had spent the night making phone calls to Henderson Construction's night security company. What she'd learned would change everything. Tom Bradley had been lying. And Emma had the phone records to prove it. The next morning brought unexpected drama. Assistant Prosecutor Robert Williams was nowhere to be found. His secretary told Judge Harrison that he'd called in sick with food poisoning, but Emma noticed Mitchell's worried glances toward the empty chair. "Your Honor," Mitchell announced, "the prosecution calls Tom Bradley to the stand." Tom Bradley, a heavy-set man in his 50s with graying hair, took the oath with confidence. As Henderson Construction's night security guard, his testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. "Mr. Bradley," Mitchell began, "please tell the court what you saw on the night of March 15th. I was doing my regular rounds when I saw Michael Rodriguez entering the building around 11 p.m. He used his keycard and went straight to Mr. Henderson's office. Did you think this was unusual? Very unusual. Employees weren't supposed to be there after 9 p.m. without special authorization." Emma listened carefully, taking notes in her childish handwriting. But something bothered her about Bradley's testimony. She'd spent hours the night before calling the security company that employed Bradley, and what she'd learned was explosive. "Mr. Bradley," Mitchell continued, "what did you do when you saw Mr. Rodriguez?" "I followed him and watched through the office window. I saw him open the safe and remove several items. Then he used the computer for about 20 minutes. "And you're certain it was Michael Rodriguez?" "Absolutely certain. I've known him for 8 years. Mitchell smiled confidently. "No further questions." Emma stood up, her step stool ready. The courtroom was packed now. Word had spread about the little girl taking on the prosecutor's office, and reporters filled the back rows. "Mr. Bradley," Emma began, her voice clear and strong, "you said you saw my father at 11 p.m. on March 15th, correct?" "That's right." Emma pulled out a document. This is your time card from Secure Guard Services for March 15th. Can you tell the jury what time you clocked out that night?" Bradley's confident expression faltered slightly. "I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly." "According to this official record, you clocked out at 8:47 p.m. Your shift ended at 9 p.m., but you left early. How could you have seen my father at 11 p.m. if you weren't even at work?" The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Mitchell jumped up. "Objection! Foundation!" "Your Honor," Emma said, "I have a sworn affidavit from Mr. Peterson, the supervisor at Secure Guard Services, confirming these records." Judge Harrison examined the document. "Overruled. Continue, Miss Rodriguez." Emma turned back to Bradley, whose face was now red with perspiration. "Mr. Bradley, you weren't at Henderson Construction on March 15th at 11 p.m., were you?" I might have gotten the dates confused, or maybe someone paid you to lie about seeing my father there." "Objection!" Mitchell shouted. "Speculation! I'll withdraw that question, Your Honor." Emma pulled out another document. "Mr. Bradley, have you ever received money from Robert Williams?" Bradley's hands began to shake. "I don't have to answer that." "Actually, you do," Judge Harrison said firmly. "Answer the question." Robert helped me out with some bills once, but that had nothing to do with this case." Emma's heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "When did Mr. Williams give you this money, Mr. Bradley?" "I don't remember exactly." Emma handed another document to the court clerk. "This is a copy of a check from Robert Williams to Tom Bradley, dated March 20th, just 5 days after you claim to have seen my father at the company. The amount is $1,500. What were those bills he was helping you with, Mr. Bradley?" The courtroom was silent, except for the scratching of reporters' pens. Bradley looked toward Mitchell desperately, but the prosecutor's face had gone ashen. I can't remember." "Mr. Bradley," Emma said, her young voice filled with righteous anger, "did Robert Williams pay you to lie about seeing my father that night?" Bradley's composure cracked completely. "I needed the money. My wife's medical bills. Williams said it wouldn't hurt anyone, that Rodriguez was guilty anyway." The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court!" But Emma wasn't finished. She had one more bombshell to drop, evidence that would expose the full scope of Williams' deception and prove her father's innocence beyond any doubt. As Tom Bradley broke down on the witness stand, confessing to his perjury, Emma knew the tide had turned. But she also knew the most dangerous part was yet to come. Williams was desperate now, and desperate people did dangerous things. The courtroom was in chaos. Tom Bradley's confession had shattered the prosecution's case, but Emma knew her work was far from over. As Judge Harrison called for a recess, Emma noticed District Attorney Mitchell huddled with his remaining staff, their faces grim with realization. During the break, Emma's mother approached her with tears in her eyes. "Mija, I'm so proud of you, but I'm also scared. What if this Williams man tries to hurt you?" Emma hugged her mother tightly. "Mama, Daddy always told me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. I won't let them destroy our family." When court resumed, Mitchell looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in one morning. "Your Honor, in light of new evidence, the prosecution requests a brief recess to review our case." But Judge Harrison was having none of it. "Mr. Mitchell, you've had months to prepare. We're proceeding." Emma stood up, her heart racing, but her resolve stronger than ever. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my next witness." I call Frank Henderson to the stand. Frank Henderson, the elderly owner of Henderson Construction, looked confused as he was sworn in. At 72, he'd built his company from nothing and trusted his employees like family. "Mr. Henderson," Emma began, "you said you trusted my father completely, right?" "Michael was like a son to me. That's why this whole thing has been so devastating." Emma nodded sympathetically. "Sir, do you remember when you updated your computer security system?" "Yes, about 4 months ago. Robert Williams recommended we upgrade everything. He said there were new threats to small businesses." Emma felt the pieces clicking into place. "And who helped you install this new system?" "Robert did. He stayed late several nights to make sure everything was set up properly, said he wanted to make sure we were protected." "Mr. Henderson, during those nights when Mr. Williams was alone with your computer system, did he ask for the new passwords and access codes?" Frank's face began to show understanding. "Yes, he said he needed them to test the security. I gave him full administrative access." Emma pulled out her final piece of evidence, a document she'd been saving for exactly this moment. "Mr. Henderson, I'd like you to look at this bank statement. It shows the account where the stolen money was deposited." Frank examined the document, his hands trembling slightly. "This says it's Michael's account, but what, Mr. Henderson? The address on this account isn't Michael's address. It's 1247 Oak Street, apartment 3B. That's where Robert Williams lives. I helped him move there when he left the company." The courtroom exploded in gasps and whispers. Emma felt a surge of triumph, but it was tempered by the knowledge that she'd just exposed a dangerous criminal who had everything to lose. "Mr. Henderson," Emma continued, "did Mr. Williams have access to employee personal information, including social security numbers?" "Yes. As our former accountant, he had access to all personnel files." Emma turned to address the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Williams used his knowledge of Henderson Construction's systems and his access to my father's personal information to open a fake bank account. He stole $50,000 and framed an innocent man." As Frank Henderson stepped down from the witness stand, his face filled with remorse for doubting Michael, Emma knew she'd proven her father's innocence. But her victory was interrupted by a commotion at the back of the courtroom. Officer Martinez burst through the doors, his radio crackling with urgent messages. "Your Honor," Martinez announced, "we have a situation. Robert Williams has been apprehended attempting to flee to Mexico with over $100,000 in cash. He's confessed to embezzling from Henderson Construction and framing Michael Rodriguez." The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Emma's triumph was bittersweet. As she looked at her father's tear-streaked face, she realized this was only the beginning of her fight for justice. Because Emma Rodriguez had just discovered something that would change her life forever. She had a gift for seeing the truth when others couldn't, and she was going to use that gift to help people who had nowhere else to turn. The youngest lawyer in American history had just won her first case, but this victory would lead to a revelation that no one, not even Emma herself, could have imagined. 3 weeks after Michael Rodriguez walked free from Jefferson County Courthouse, Emma's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The little girl who had trembled with her oversized briefcase was now the subject of national headlines. 7-year-old legal prodigy saves father, the youngest lawyer in American history. Child genius takes on the system. But fame came with a price Emma hadn't expected. Their small apartment on Maple Street was now constantly surrounded by news vans and reporters. Emma couldn't walk to the library without being followed by cameras. Her mother, Maria, had to take leave from her nursing job to protect Emma from the media circus. "Mija," Maria said one evening as they watched yet another news report about Emma's case, "I'm worried about you. You're only 7 years old. You should be playing with dolls, not giving interviews to CNN." Emma looked up from the stack of letters that had arrived that day, requests for help from families across the country who couldn't afford lawyers. Each letter contained a story of injustice, a plea for someone to believe them when no one else would. "Mama, look at this," Emma said, holding up a letter written in shaky handwriting. "Mrs. Patterson from Alabama says her grandson was wrongly accused of selling drugs at school. The evidence doesn't make sense, but no one will listen to her because she's just a grandmother. Maria's heart ached as she watched her daughter's innocence battling with her sense of justice. "Emma, you can't save everyone." "But what if I can save some of them?" Emma replied, her brown eyes reflecting a wisdom far beyond her years. "What if God gave me this gift for a reason?" The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Judge Harrison stood at their door, her usually stern expression softened with genuine concern. "Mrs. Rodriguez, may I speak with Emma?" Judge Harrison asked. "I have a proposition that might interest you both." In their tiny living room, Judge Harrison explained that the American Bar Association was considering creating a special provision for exceptional minors to practice law under strict supervision. Emma would be the first candidate for this groundbreaking program. "Emma," Judge Harrison said, "you've shown remarkable legal acumen, but you need proper training. Harvard Law School has offered to create a special educational track for you. You'd study with professors while still being a child, with full protection and support." Emma's eyes widened. Harvard Law School, the place she'd only dreamed about while reading legal textbooks in the library, but there was a catch. "You'd have to move to Cambridge, Massachusetts. It would mean leaving your family, your friends, everything familiar." Emma looked at her mother, seeing the conflict in Maria's eyes. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, but it would tear their small family apart. "I need to think about it," Emma said quietly. That night, as Emma lay in bed, she heard her parents talking in hushed voices. Her father, Michael, had been struggling to find work since his release. Word of his arrest had spread through the construction industry, and despite his exoneration, employers were hesitant to hire him. "Maybe Emma's gift is the answer to our prayers," Michael whispered. "If she becomes a famous lawyer, she can help families like ours. She can make sure no innocent person goes through what I went through." But Maria's voice was thick with tears. "She's just a baby, Michael. I don't want to lose my little girl to the world." Emma closed her eyes and made a decision that would change everything. She would go to Harvard, but not for fame or money. She would go to become the voice for people who had no voice, the defender of those who couldn't defend themselves. She didn't know it yet, but this decision would lead her to the biggest case of her young life, a case that would test everything she'd learned and force her to confront a truth about herself that was both wonderful and terrifying. Because Emma Rodriguez was about to discover that her gift for seeing justice wasn't just unusual. It was unprecedented in ways that would reshape the entire legal system. Cambridge, Massachusetts felt like another world to Emma Rodriguez. The ancient brick buildings of Harvard Law School towered above her like giants, their ivy-covered walls whispering centuries of legal tradition. At 7 years old, surrounded by professors and graduate students, Emma had never felt smaller or more determined. Dean Margaret Whitfield, a distinguished woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had designed Emma's special program personally. "Emma," she explained on her first day, "you'll attend modified lectures, work with a tutor, and most importantly, you'll observe real cases in our legal clinic." Emma's tutor was Professor James Crawford, a former Supreme Court clerk who specialized in constitutional law. During their first session, he tested Emma's knowledge with complex hypothetical cases. "Emma, imagine a scenario where a confession was obtained without proper Miranda rights, but the defendant is clearly guilty based on physical evidence. How do you proceed?" Emma considered carefully. "Professor Crawford, guilt doesn't matter if the system is broken. If we allow violations of constitutional rights for some people, we create a precedent that endangers everyone's rights." Crawford's eyebrows rose with surprise and admiration. "Excellent reasoning. But what if the defendant committed a violent crime? What about the victims?" "Then we find another way to prove guilt that respects the law," Emma replied firmly. Justice isn't about taking shortcuts. It's about doing things the right way, even when it's harder. 3 months into her Harvard experience, Emma received a letter that would change everything. It came from a maximum security prison in Texas, written in careful script by a man named David Martinez. "Dear Emma," the letter began, "I saw you on the news, and I'm writing because I have nowhere else to turn. I've been on death row for 8 years for a murder I didn't commit. My court-appointed lawyer barely spoke to me, and key evidence was never presented. I have 3 months before my execution date. I know you're just a child, but you're my only hope." Emma read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling. Death row. Execution. These weren't words a 7-year-old should have to understand, but Emma understood them perfectly. She brought the letter to Professor Crawford, who read it with a grave expression. "Emma, death penalty cases are extraordinarily complex. They require years of experience and massive resources." "But what if he's innocent?" Emma asked. "What if David Martinez dies because no one will listen to him?" Crawford studied Emma's determined face and made a decision that would shock the legal establishment. "If you're serious about this, I'll help you. But we'll need to build a team, and we'll be working against impossible odds." Within a week, Emma had assembled an unprecedented legal team. Professor Crawford provided constitutional expertise. Sarah Chen, a brilliant third-year law student, handled research. Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic expert, agreed to review the evidence pro bono. But when Emma called David Martinez's prison to arrange a consultation, she encountered her first major obstacle. "I'm sorry, miss," the warden said with barely concealed amusement, "but children aren't allowed in maximum security facilities. There are no exceptions." Emma felt her heart sink, but then she remembered her father's words. "When someone tells you something is impossible, Mija, that's when you know it's worth fighting for." The next morning, Emma filed a federal lawsuit against the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, demanding the right to represent her client regardless of her age. The case, Rodriguez versus Texas Department of Criminal Justice, made national headlines. Child prodigy sues for right to visit death row client. The legal establishment was divided. Some called Emma's lawsuit frivolous. Others recognized it as a groundbreaking civil rights case that could reshape how the justice system viewed age discrimination. But Emma didn't care about the controversy. She cared about David Martinez, who had 3 months to live and no one else willing to fight for him. As she prepared for what would be the most important legal battle of her young life, Emma had no idea that someone was watching her every move. Someone who had a very personal interest in making sure David Martinez's case never saw the light of day. Someone who knew that Emma Rodriguez was getting dangerously close to uncovering a secret that could destroy careers, expose corruption, and reveal a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the Texas justice system. The little girl who had saved her father was about to take on an entire state, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The federal courthouse in Austin, Texas, buzzed with tension as Emma Rodriguez, now 8 years old, prepared to argue her case for the right to visit death row. 3 television networks carried the proceedings live, and protesters on both sides filled the courthouse steps. Judge Robert Sterling, a Reagan appointee known for his strict constitutional interpretation, looked down at Emma with curiosity and concern. "Miss Rodriguez, you understand the gravity of what you're requesting? Maximum security facilities have age restrictions for public safety reasons." Emma stood at the defendant's table, flanked by Professor Crawford and a team of Harvard law students. Despite her small stature, her voice carried clearly through the courtroom. "Your Honor, the Sixth Amendment guarantees every defendant the right to adequate representation. David Martinez chose me as his attorney. The state cannot deny that right based solely on my age." Texas Attorney General Patricia Collins, A formidable woman in her 50s rose to respond. "Your Honor, this is about more than age. A maximum security facility houses the most dangerous criminals in our state. No child should be exposed to that environment, regardless of her legal abilities." Emma had anticipated this argument. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for unrestricted access. I'm requesting supervised attorney-client meetings in a secure conference room. The same rights granted to every other attorney in Texas." As the arguments continued, Emma noticed something troubling. Every time she mentioned David Martinez's case specifics, Attorney General Collins seemed to exchange glances with a man sitting in the back of the courtroom, a tall, thin man with cold eyes who took notes constantly. During the lunch recess, Professor Crawford pulled Emma aside. "Emma, I've been researching David Martinez's original case. There are some disturbing inconsistencies." Emma listened intently as Crawford explained. The key witness who identified Martinez changed his story 3 times. The murder weapon was found 2 weeks after the crime scene was supposedly secured, and the DNA evidence that convicted him was processed by a lab that's since been discredited for falsifying results. "So he really is innocent?" Emma asked, though she'd suspected it from his letters. "More than that," Crawford said grimly. "I think someone deliberately framed him, and I think they're very nervous that you're getting involved." That afternoon, Judge Sterling delivered his ruling. While this court recognizes the unusual circumstances of this case, the Sixth Amendment does indeed guarantee the right to chosen counsel. Miss Rodriguez will be permitted supervised visits with her client with appropriate security measures in place. Emma's victory was interrupted by unexpected news. David Martinez's execution date had been moved up by 2 months. Instead of having 3 months to prepare, she now had just 4 weeks. "This is highly irregular," Professor Crawford told Emma as they reviewed the court order. "Execution dates are rarely moved up without extraordinary circumstances." Emma studied the document, her 8-year-old mind processing implications that would challenge seasoned attorneys. "Professor, what if someone wants David Martinez dead before we can prove his innocence?" The next morning brought more troubling news. Dr. Patricia Williams, the forensic expert who had agreed to review Martinez's case, called with alarming information. "Emma, I've been trying to access the original evidence from David's case, but I'm being told it's been destroyed. All of it. DNA samples, fingerprints, even the murder weapon. Supposedly it was routine disposal, but the timing is suspicious." Emma felt a chill of fear, but also a surge of determination. Someone was going to extraordinary lengths to prevent her from investigating this case, which meant she was on the right track. "Dr. Williams, they can destroy evidence, but they can't destroy witnesses. David's original lawyer is still alive, and so is the prosecutor who put him on death row. If we can't prove David's innocence with physical evidence, we'll have to prove it with the truth." What Emma didn't know was that the prosecutor who had convicted David Martinez 15 years earlier was now in a position of immense power, a position that would allow him to make Emma's investigation much more dangerous than she realized. As Emma prepared for her first visit to death row, she had no idea that she was walking into a trap that had been 15 years in the making. A trap that would test not just her legal skills, but her courage, her wisdom, and her unwavering belief that justice was worth any sacrifice. Time was running out for David Martinez, but time was also running out for the people who had framed him, because Emma Rodriguez was coming, and she was bringing the truth with her. The maximum security unit of Huntsville State Penitentiary felt like entering another world. Emma walked through multiple checkpoints, her 8-year-old hand dwarfed by the massive security doors that clanged shut behind her. Guard Captain Morris, a stern but surprisingly gentle man, escorted her to the attorney conference room. Miss Rodriguez, Captain Morris said quietly. In 30 years of working here, I've never seen anything like this. That man has maintained his innocence every single day for 8 years. Never caused trouble, never stopped hoping. Most death row inmates. They change after a while. David Martinez hasn't, makes you wonder. Ota, when Emma first saw David Martinez through the reinforced glass, her heart broke. At 35, he looked older than her father, his dark hair prematurely grey, his eyes holding a sadness that seemed bottomless. But when he smiled at her, she saw something else. Hope. "You must be Emma," David said through the intercom, his voice gentle despite everything. "I can't believe a little girl is willing to fight for me when the whole system gave up." Emma opened her briefcase, a new one, properly sized for her growing collection of legal documents. "Mr. Martinez, I believe you're innocent. But I need you to tell me everything about the night Patricia Hendricks was murdered." David's story was heartbreaking. 15 years ago, he'd been a college student working part-time at a convenience store to pay for his education. The night of the murder, he'd been studying at the library until closing, then had gone straight home to his apartment. "The police arrested me 3 days later," David explained. "They said a witness saw me leaving Patricia's apartment building around the time she was killed. But Emma, I'd never even met Patricia Hendricks. I didn't know she existed until they accused me of murdering her." Emma took careful notes, her young mind already identifying inconsistencies. Who was this witness? "A man named Thomas Walsh. He claimed he saw me running from the building. But Emma, I was at the library that night. I checked out 3 books at 9:15 p.m., just 15 minutes before the murder supposedly happened. The library was 2 miles away." Emma's pulse quickened. "Mr. Martinez, do you still have the library receipts?" David's face fell. "My original lawyer said they weren't important. He never presented them at trial." After her visit, Emma returned to Harvard with a burning determination. She immediately called the Austin Public Library and spoke with Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian. "Miss Rodriguez, I remember that night perfectly," Mrs. Henderson said. "David Martinez was one of our regular students, very polite, very dedicated. He was here until we closed at 9:30 p.m. I specifically remember because he asked to check out additional books for his criminal justice studies." Emma's hands trembled as she wrote down Mrs. Henderson's statement. David Martinez couldn't have committed the murder. He had an ironclad alibi that was never presented at his trial. But the revelation that shattered Emma's understanding of the case came when she researched the prosecutor who had convicted David Martinez 15 years earlier, District Attorney William Morrison. The same William Morrison who was now Texas Attorney General. The same William Morrison who had the power to move up execution dates. The same William Morrison who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom during Emma's hearing, taking notes with cold, calculating eyes. Emma's heart pounded as the pieces fell into place. Morrison had built his political career on high-profile convictions. The Martinez case had been his stepping stone to higher office. If David's innocence was proven, it wouldn't just free one man, it would destroy Morrison's career and expose a pattern of prosecutorial misconduct that could span decades. But Emma's most shocking discovery came when she investigated the original witness, Thomas Walsh. According to public records, Walsh had died in a car accident 6 months after testifying against David Martinez. But Emma's research revealed something terrifying. Thomas Walsh had received $50,000 from an anonymous source just 1 week before the trial. Someone had paid Walsh to lie, and when Walsh became a liability, he'd been eliminated. Emma's hands shook as she called Professor Crawford. "Professor, I think David Martinez was framed by the same person who's now trying to have him executed before we can prove his innocence." Crawford's voice was grim. "Emma, if you're right, then you're not just fighting for one innocent man. You're taking on a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of Texas government." Emma looked at the photo of David Martinez she kept on her desk, a man who had spent 8 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit, whose execution was now just 2 weeks away. "Then that's what we'll do, Professor. We'll take them all down." But Emma didn't know that William Morrison had been monitoring her investigation from the beginning, and he'd just made a decision that would put Emma in more danger than she could imagine. The conspiracy was about to fight back, and they were willing to do anything, including harming a child, to keep their secrets buried. 10 days before David Martinez's scheduled execution, Emma Rodriguez received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was disguised, electronic, but the message was crystal clear. "Stop investigating the Martinez case, little girl, or you and your family will regret it." Emma's hands trembled as she hung up the phone, but her resolve only strengthened. She immediately called FBI agent Sarah Chen, no relation to her jury member from her father's case, who had been quietly investigating corruption in the Texas justice system. "Emma," Agent Chen said during their secure video call, "we've been building a case against William Morrison for 3 years. Your investigation has provided the missing pieces we needed. But you're in real danger now. Morrison's career, his freedom, everything depends on David Martinez dying before the truth comes out." Emma was staying in a secure apartment near Harvard, protected by federal marshals, but she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out for David. Her legal team had filed emergency appeals, presented new evidence, and even petitioned the governor for clemency. But every door seemed to slam shut as soon as Morrison's influence reached it. "Professor Crawford," Emma said during one of their late-night strategy sessions, "what if we can't save David through the courts? What if the system is too corrupt?" Crawford looked at his remarkable 8-year-old student with deep sadness. "Emma, sometimes the system fails good people. Sometimes justice is delayed so long that it becomes injustice." But Emma refused to accept defeat. She had learned something in her young life that many adults never understood. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption wasn't legal precedent or political influence. Sometimes it was simple truth, spoken by someone brave enough to say it. That's when Emma made a decision that would shock the nation. She called a press conference for the morning of David Martinez's execution. Every major news network, newspaper, and online outlet would be there. She would present all her evidence publicly, expose the conspiracy, and force the world to see what was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma began, standing behind a podium specially lowered for her height, "my name is Emma Rodriguez, and I'm here to tell you about the greatest miscarriage of justice I've ever witnessed." For 20 minutes, Emma laid out her case with devastating precision. She presented the library records that proved David's alibi. She showed the financial records proving Thomas Walsh was paid to lie. She revealed the pattern of prosecutorial misconduct that had characterized Morrison's career. David Martinez has been on death row for 8 years because William Morrison needed a conviction to advance his political career, Emma declared, her young voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "In 6 hours, an innocent man will die unless we stop this travesty." But Emma's most powerful moment came when she looked directly into the cameras and spoke from her heart. "I'm 8 years old," she said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. "I should be in 3rd grade, worrying about spelling tests and playground arguments. Instead, I'm here fighting for a man's life because the adults who were supposed to protect justice failed him." She paused, gathering her strength for her final appeal. "David Martinez wrote to me because he had nowhere else to turn. He believed that even a child could see the truth when grown-ups refused to look. Today, I'm asking all of you to be children again, to see this case with clear eyes and honest hearts, to demand justice not because it's politically convenient, but because it's right." Emma's press conference was broadcast live across the nation. Social media exploded with support for David Martinez. Protesters gathered outside the Texas state capitol. Phone lines to the governor's office were jammed with calls demanding clemency. But William Morrison wasn't finished fighting. In the shadows, he was preparing one final desperate move to silence Emma Rodriguez forever. As the clock ticked toward David Martinez's execution, Emma had no idea that she'd just painted a target on her back. Morrison had decided that if he was going down, he wouldn't go down alone. The little girl who had started this journey to save her father was about to face the greatest test of her young life. And this time, legal briefs and courtroom arguments wouldn't be enough to save her. The final confrontation was coming, and only one of them would survive it with their integrity intact. At 5:47 p.m., on what was supposed to be David Martinez's final day on Earth, Emma Rodriguez sat in a secure FBI conference room watching the most important phone call of her life. FBI agent Sarah Chen held the receiver with steady hands, but Emma could see the tension in her eyes. "Governor Williams," Agent Chen said into the phone, "we have irrefutable evidence that David Martinez is innocent and that Attorney General William Morrison orchestrated his wrongful conviction. We need that execution stayed immediately." Emma held her breath. After months of fighting, after exposing corruption at the highest levels, after putting her own safety at risk, everything came down to this moment. "Yes, sir," Agent Chen continued. "I understand the political implications, but an innocent man's life hangs in the balance." Through the conference room windows, Emma could see news vans lined up outside. Her press conference that morning had ignited a firestorm of public outrage. Social media hashtags, "Adi Save David Martinez" and "Justice for Emma" were trending worldwide. Celebrities, politicians, and ordinary citizens were demanding answers. But William Morrison wasn't going down without a fight. At exactly 6 p.m., as Emma watched the news coverage, breaking news flashed across every screen. Texas Attorney General William Morrison arrested on federal conspiracy charges. Emma's hands flew to her mouth as she watched Morrison being led away in handcuffs, his political career ending in the most public disgrace imaginable. FBI agents had raided his office and home simultaneously, finding evidence of not just David Martinez's wrongful conviction, but a pattern of corruption spanning 2 decades. Agent Chen hung up the phone with a smile that lit up the entire room. "Emma, Governor Williams has granted David Martinez a full pardon. He's being released immediately." Emma burst into tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming relief and joy. She had done it. Against impossible odds, she had saved an innocent man's life and exposed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. But the most remarkable revelation was yet to come. 3 hours later, Emma stood outside Huntsville State Penitentiary as David Martinez walked through the gates a free man. At 35, he looked older than his years, but his eyes shone with something Emma had never seen before: complete freedom. "Emma," David said, kneeling down to her level, tears streaming down his face, "you gave me back my life. How can I ever thank you?" Emma hugged him tightly, this man she had fought so hard to save. "Mr. Martinez, you don't need to thank me. You just need to live the life you were meant to live." The media frenzy that followed was unprecedented. Emma's story captured the imagination of the entire world. But the most significant outcome wasn't the news coverage or the book deals or the movie rights that Hollywood offered. It was the phone call Emma received the next morning from Chief Justice Margaret Roberts of the United States Supreme Court. "Emma," Justice Roberts said, her voice filled with admiration, "what you've accomplished is nothing short of miraculous. But more than that, you've exposed fundamental flaws in our justice system that we can no longer ignore. Emma listened intently as Justice Roberts explained that her case had prompted an emergency review of the entire American legal system. Because of your work, Congress is drafting the Martinez Act, comprehensive judicial reform that will prevent wrongful convictions and ensure that no innocent person ever faces execution again. You've quite literally changed the course of American justice. But the revelation that took Emma's breath away came next. Emma, there's something else. Your legal work in the Martinez case has been reviewed by constitutional scholars across the nation. Your brief was so thoroughly researched, so brilliantly argued, that it's being studied in law schools as a masterpiece of legal reasoning. Justice Roberts paused, and Emma could hear the smile in her voice. Emma Rodriguez, at 8 years old, you have just become the youngest person in American history to single-handedly overturn a death sentence, expose government corruption, and inspire federal legislation. You're not just a remarkable child, you're a legal pioneer who will be remembered alongside the greatest advocates for justice in our nation's history. 6 months later, Emma stood in the Rose Garden of the White House as President Johnson signed the Martinez Act into law. David Martinez stood beside her, now working as a victims' rights advocate, dedicating his freedom to helping others who had been failed by the system. Emma, President Johnson said, as he handed her the ceremonial pen used to sign the legislation, you've proven that justice isn't about age or experience. It's about courage, determination, and an unwavering belief that truth will prevail. Emma looked out at the crowd gathered for the ceremony. Her parents, Professor Crawford, Judge Harrison, and hundreds of others who had supported her journey. But her eyes found David Martinez, the man whose life she had saved, who now had the chance to make his dreams come true. Mr. President, Emma said, her voice clear and strong, my daddy always told me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. Today, I know he was right. As applause echoed through the Rose Garden, Emma Rodriguez, now 9 years old, realized that her journey was just beginning. She had saved one innocent man, but there were thousands more who needed her help. The little girl who had entered a courthouse trembling with fear had become something the world had never seen before, a child who could move mountains, change laws, and prove that even the smallest voice could speak the loudest truth. And somewhere in Texas, William Morrison sat in a federal prison cell, finally paying the price for his crimes, while David Martinez walked free under the same sun that had once been scheduled to set on his life forever. Justice, Emma had learned, wasn't just about winning cases. It was about making sure that no one, no matter how small, how young, or how powerless they seemed, ever had to face injustice alone. The youngest lawyer in American history had become something even more remarkable, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been told their fight was impossible, and Emma Rodriguez was just getting started.